Come with me as once more we delve into the depths of what can be quite a dark subject, English medieval social history. Alright guys, welcome back to Social History Sunday. Now, you're going to have to bear with me with this one because we're talking about beer, ale, English pub culture, English drinking habits. Now, if I'm slurring my words a little bit, it's because I've already had a couple of these. I think I've had about 4 attempts at making this video so far, and each attempt involved a bottle of beer. Beer, ale, alcoholic beverage, pub culture is very important within England and has been for a very long time. Now, if we go back in the archaeological record, there is archaeological evidence in England, and we're not deliberately ignoring Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, but we're just talking about England. There is archaeological evidence dating back some 7,000 years for the production of ale, of an alcoholic beverage. 7,000 years. Now, when you consider that the British Isles have only been, shall we say, permanently occupied for about 8,000 years. The record goes back of alcohol being produced about 7,000 years ago. Obviously there were people in the British Isles before that, but it was only occupied, as in settled, about 8,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago. Before that it was just a hunting ground. But anyway, getting off the point. So for about 7,000 years we have been producing in England ale. Not beer, ale. Of which this is an extremely excellent example of an ale. It's a brown ale. Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. Lovely. It's a brown ale by Newcastle Breweries, Newcastle Brown Ale. Now, I'm not saying this to advertise, although if Newcastle Breweries would like to send me a crate of brown ale, I would not object. But I'm mentioning Newcastle to make a point. Now, there's a couple of connections here with language and culture and the whole brewing thing within England, connected just in this one bottle. Newcastle Brown Ale. Now, Newcastle is an area, well, Newcastle is a main city in the northeast of England. And it's where Geordies come from. Now, Geordies have their own peculiar language. It's called Geordie. Just like Cockneys and Scousers and Brummies and Manx and people like that. There are a lot of colloquialisms, excuse my slurred speech, there are a lot of colloquialisms within the Geordie accent because it used to be a language in its own right. And they're called Geordies. Now this stuff is called brown ale. Now an ale is an alcoholic beverage made out of a single malted grain, primarily barley. Now the malting process, you force the grain to germinate, and then when it gets to a certain point you stop it germinating and you dry it out. The germinating process generates sugars and yeasts within and on the surface of the grain, and that's what you make your ale out of. And brown ale is a particular type of ale. Now, I mention the word brown because if you go back in the language record, the word brown is actually quite a modern addition to the English language. Only dates back to, I believe, like the 16th century. Before that, the word we used was either brun or bruin, as in B-R-O-U-E-N, brun, which is of a German origin, or brun, B-R-O-O-N, which is of Scandinavian origin, part of the Old English language going back to the pre-Roman times, or to the Roman times and just after. So, and I mention this because if you ever go to Newcastle on a Friday or Saturday night, and you watch the local wildlife, as in the girls and boys wandering around down by the quayside, even in midwinter you will see the ubiquitous miniskirt. Young lasses, 18, 19, 20, in the early 20s, walking around in a snowstorm wearing a miniskirt. They're a hardy bunch in Newcastle. The lads will be wearing t-shirts and jeans in snowstorms, and they're on the riverside. And the way Newcastle quayside is positioned, you have a permanent wind blowing in off the North Sea, which sometimes at some points in the year comes direct from Siberia, and you'll still see them wearing t-shirts and miniskirts. It's a sight to behold. It's a good night out as well. If you're ever over in England, or if you're ever up in the area, go to Newcastle. Newcastle quayside, fantastic night out. You see lots of this being drunk. But anyway, getting back to the point. So if you wander into a bar along the quayside, you just sit and listen, and you do a little bit of people watching, and do a little bit of like anthropology, you will no doubt at some point hear the phrase "Giz a bottle of brún." Now it sounds almost Scottish, but it's not. It's not quite Northumbrian. It's Geordie. Giz a bottle of brún. And it basically means, can you give me a bottle of brown ale, please? Giz a bottle of brún. And the word is brún. And even to this day, they use the Anglo-Saxon word for brown, brún. And there we have it. And there's a particularly excellent example, Newcastle Brown Ale. Even to this day, it's still called that. Now, what's the difference between an ale and a beer? Well, beers don't exist. They don't appear in the English psyche until about the 1600s. Well, actually, a little bit earlier, 1500s. Because we didn't have beers. Beers are Northern and Eastern European. Ales are British and English. Excuse me. As I said before, an ale is made out of one specific grain. A beer is made out of multiple grains, can be as many as 15 separate grains, depending on where in Europe it's made. And beers tend to be a lighter colour. We would tend to call them a lager today. Like most people, you just call it a beer, but a beer is a completely different thing to an ale. And the British alcoholic beverages tend to be ales, made from a single grain. Now, around about 1400, that's when hops were introduced into the English beer, the English brewing system, in an attempt really to standardise the flavour. See, prior to the the early 1400s, when we made an ale, we used barley, primarily barley, but we would flavour it with whatever we had handy at the time. You would use fruits such as plums, apples, pears, that sort of thing. You would use seeds like juniper berries, strawberries. Right, so as you can see, I let the battery go flat on the camera without realising. It's good stuff. So anyway, so we were talking about how the beer was made. Now we're up to, but as we come up to the Norman Conquest era, beers started to become, alcohol drinking started to become more regulated. The monasteries got in on the act and started creating their own specific recipes and brews, and they started encompassing larger and larger areas for selling their ales in the alehouses. Rather than just having individual village ales, you would have regional ales which would be sold in those alehouses. And then when we get to, so it's becoming more regulated, and it's so you have a situation where each of the different orders of monks, like for instance the Benedictines, the Cistercians, people like that, they actually create their own recipes and standardize those recipes and sell them in all the areas where they're active. So we become regulated. And then we come up to the reign of Henry II. Now he standardized a lot of stuff, excuse me. He standardized weights and measures and all sorts of things. One of the things he also standardized was the amount of grain that had to be used in beer, in ale production. For every 1 gallon of ale, there had to be a minimum of 2 pounds of grains and seeds and spices used in that ale. Now this is actually where the 1.98 pound weight comes in that we as archers use for spine checking arrows. For every gallon, as per King Henry II's instructions, for every gallon of ale produced, each gallon must contain a minimum of 2 pounds of seeds and grains, and no more than 1/3 of an ounce of spices and flavourings. So 1.98 roughly pounds of barley, malted barley, and you can make up the remainder to 2 pound using flavourings. It was another attempt to standardise the alcohol content, the specific gravity of the ales, and the flavours of the ales as well. And then, the next time we come to standardisation is actually in the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta specifically mentions a measurement called the London quarter, and it's effectively everything has to be based. The base measurement for everything is the quarter ton or the long ton, which is basically, depending on the time period, between 220 and 250 pounds, with 1,000 pounds being a ton. And everything is worked off that London quarter, including the weight and specific weight and the amount of solids in a barrel of ale. For instance, a 30-gallon barrel of ale weighs 1/4 of a ton, 250 pounds. And you can divide that all down into grains and ounces and all sorts of things. It's actually quite an interesting thing to do. It's quite complicated, but it's quite interesting. But it also served to standardise the price of the price of ale as well. And it works out that for every London quarter of ale produced, a 30-gallon barrel of ale works out that at around about 3 pence a pint, which in the 14th century was around about the right price for a pint of ale. We know this from records that we have of ales being sold. So we've reached the 1400s now. It's at this point that hops are introduced to the brewing system within England. Again, it's another attempt at standardising the flavour of ale, so that no matter where you go in the country, you will recognise a good ale. And ales are quite a good ale has quite a bittersweet taste. And they started using hops instead of the various spices and flavourings to standardise that flavour, that bittersweet flavour. And even to this day, if you go into a pub that serves real ales, you will have ales and you'll have best and you'll have bitter and things like that. And a bitter is something which is a standard ale, but the recipe dates back to when they started to use hops rather than things like juniper to flavour the beer, to give the ale its bitter flavour. They started using hops in the 1400s, and after that, if you have a bitter ale, that's what you're getting. You're getting a recipe which is 600 years old, which is based on the use of hops. Now the next thing that comes in is licensing. As ale production, beer production now that we're using hops, beer production becomes more and more regulated and more standardised across the country, and we're getting more and more breweries being set up in specific regions. Like I believe the oldest known brewery was called the Shepherd's Limb Brewery, I think, which is either Havisham or Evesham, I can't remember which. But they were set up in about the 1530s. The local government and the Crown started to recognise that there was money to be made here, that this could be taxed. And the Crown gave every local council, parish council, village council, the right to issue licences and to regulate the sale of alcohol, so they could control who could sell it, who it could be sold to, what days it could be sold on, and they would get a licence fee. Now the first recorded licence, now if I can remember this properly, was the Bingley Arms, which is either located in Ely, was located either in Ely or in Keighley. Anyway, it was near Leeds in North Yorkshire, and that was 1513, was the first licence to sell alcoholic beverages. So that was it. And from that point on, local authorities, councils, things like that, could issue licences. But it still wasn't fully standardised. You still had regional and local variations, because you had a situation now where you had two types of alcoholic beverage. You have beers and ales which are being sold. Now the only difference today, generally speaking, between a beer and an ale is actually the name. Certain breweries will say they produce an ale rather than a beer. Other places will say they produce, like for instance, one of my favourite, Newcastle Ale, Newcastle Brown Ale is technically an ale, but you have other companies like Theakston's who only produce ales to traditional recipes. Newcastle breweries actually produce some things that they call beers. Theakston's don't. Everything they produce is an ale. But then you have other companies like I'm trying to think of one, McEwan's. All their products are beers, and they're multigrained and light coloured. So you have that situation where breweries were starting to specialise in particular things, and then you started to get individual ale houses which were connected specifically to breweries from about the 1500s onwards, which is exactly the same as it is today. So you ended up with two classes of alehouse, or there were still alehouses at the time, inns and taverns, things like that. Taverns, by the way, tended to sell wines. Inns tended to sell ales. So you had alehouses, inns and taverns by this time. Where was I? Yes. So you have alehouses specifically connected to breweries, and all they sold in those alehouses was the breweries that came from, the products that came from those breweries. They tended to be quite standardised. It happens all the time, even today. But then you had what they were just called alehouses. But you also had what was called a free house. Now a free house was a little bit different. And this dates back to when the monks were, all the different brotherhoods of monks were selling all their ales. They would actually transport ales all over the, well, not all over the country, but quite widely, and they would sell their ales through free houses. Now a free house, and you still have them today, is able to stock and sell any alcoholic beverage by any manufacturer, any producer, no matter what. Whereas a brewery house tends to produce just brewery ales. Right, so it's like complicated. Everything about English and socialist is complicated. So we're up to the 1500s, and the first license produced, like applied to a public house, well, an ale house. And then the public houses start appearing in 1810. I want to say 1810, but I think that's wrong. With the Public Houses Act, whereby all premises within the country have to be licensed, that are selling alcohol to the public have to be licensed as selling alcohol. You can no longer just set up a microbrewery in your back garden, in your backyard, and sell it out of the front of your house. You have to be licensed, and you have to comply with the Public Houses Act. I'm sure it's 1810, 1817, 1810, 1817. At that point, everything becomes standardised. And that's where the term public house comes from. So even though we had public houses in spirit all the way back to the Roman, like post-Roman times, the public house itself doesn't exist until I keep thinking 1817. It's until 1817. Prior to that, anybody could set up and manufacture ale or beers and sell them out the front. If I'd lived in the 14th century in this little bungalow here, I could set up a microbrewery out the back, making my own ale, and sell it through the front window. People would come along and they would buy your ale and they would drink it, and might even just stand around on the front and drink it, and then they'd have a pint and then they'd wander off again. It was quite refreshing, and it really is quite refreshing as well. Anyway, it's another one of those subjects. You'll have to forgive this one if it's a little bit meandering, because I have actually had several beers and I've really enjoyed them actually. And I've had me bar snacks, the little cheesy biscuits to go with me brown ale. You can't beat a cheesy cheddar if you can get it out of the packet. It won't come out of the packet. There we go. A cheesy cheddar with a slurp of brown ale. Can't be beat. Now, there's something we haven't touched on, and that is, why did drinking establishments, ale houses, free houses, brewery houses, public houses become so popular? Well, I think it's to do with what we were drinking rather than societal. If you look at the continent, most of the medieval Europe, they're drinking wines rather than beers. Germany and Northern Europe is drinking beers. France and South and Western Europe is drinking wine. And I think that makes a difference. Because I think the wine drinking, it's a much more mellow way of drinking. It's a much more relaxed way of drinking. It's an easier drink to produce as well, because fruits such as grapes actually naturally grow the yeast on the surface of the plant. Any plant that develops sugar as part of its maturing process will grow a yeast. So if you want to grow a wine, if you want to make a wine, literally all you have to do is mash the grapes up, add water, put them in a cupboard out of the way, and it will start to ferment. And they actually have quite a lot of yeast on the surface of the fruits. Now you can do that with apples and pears, as we do in England, to make ciders and perries, but it's a much longer process because the fruits are harder and they are much more difficult to break down, even though they do have the yeasts. Now where the revolution comes in beer making was when the Germans started to create specific yeasts for beer making. And again, when the hops came to England in the 1400s, they brought the yeasts with them as well. So it was no longer just a case of sticking the mash of barley and flavourings in a big tub in the airing cupboard out of the way. You could actually have fermentation take place within a couple of days, because the yeast that the Germans produced in the 13 and 1400s were so active that you could ferment and create beers in no time at all. And there was another thing as well. Now I don't know the specifics, but I know that beer in England, actually, when they've done tests with specific recipes and things like that, and they've done some archaeological research, it was found that beer actually had a lower bacteria count than most fresh water supplies, which is why we had a situation in